welcome once again to the Open Mic Writers in Their Own Words, the show where every episode I talk to writers, editors, agents, various folks in the publishing game to learn a little bit more about them and the work they do, and hopefully how their experiences could help you in your own efforts to become a published author. Before I introduce my guest, though, I always like to take a moment, ask you please hit the subscribe button so you never miss a future episode. If you're watching it on YouTube or you're listening on whatever podcast platform you prefer, you could always leave a five-star review. That'd be great. Or even any kind of comment. I always appreciate those. Reviews are great. All those things are great because it helps other people find the show. What also helps people find the show, and if you would be so kind, if you enjoy this, is to tell a friend or anyone you know who might be interested in, following their own writing path, because I guarantee you're going to learn something about what it takes to have even a little bit of success trying to become a writer in this world. It's not an easy task, and I have tremendous admiration for so many of the folks out there who have had success with it because I know how hard it is. So anyway, share that information with somebody you know who might want to learn how to become a better writer. My guest today is the writer behind the Twin Cities Mystery series, which features detectives Erik Jansson and Deb Metzger. And that series has been widely lauded for a number of things, including, very clever plots, witty and intelligent dialogue, and just generally being great reads. She is also an excellent short fiction author, including having a story in a great new anthology that just came out in September called On Fire and Underwater. It was edited by a mutual friend of ours, Curtis Ippolito, out from Rock and a Hard Place Press, which, like I say, if you haven't seen it, I highly recommend it. It explores the intersection of climate change and crime. And if that sounds a little odd to you, trust me, it's not. It's a great anthology. Go out and get it. Without further delay, let me welcome my guest today, Priscilla Paton. How are you doing today?
Very good. And thank you so much, Rich, for this opportunity.
Oh, absolutely. I'm really glad we finally got you on the show. I want to start with the Twin Cities Mystery Series because
Mhm.
for the uninitiated out there, tell us a little bit about those books. And I know there's three. We haven't seen one, though, in a little bit. So tell me if we're going to see any more anytime soon.
Yes, you are going to see more. I'm actually writing number 5 right now. Number 4, In Blind Trust, is in the editing process. And I'm sort of very anxious to get it. It goes back and forth several times before it goes to print. I have to admit, though, I was slowed down a bit by life events, and I think that's something that happens to many writers, and you just sort of have to accept it, whether it's an illness or a family issue or having to suddenly downsize, COVID, being too upset over the current political climate.
Hmm.
You can't, I found I was beating myself up because I was slowed down by some of those things, and
Yeah,
I found that was useless. Just say, well, I'm a writer, it'll happen, and then move on.
absolutely. Well, like I say, tell us a little bit about your characters in particular, because um, you have described your two protagonists, Erik Jansson and Deb Metzger, as being quote unquote vinegar and oil, that kind of a couple. If you would expound on that for me just a bit, tell us a little bit about them and how that relationship between those characters has evolved over the life of the series.
I think I'll start first with a broader question, which is I think of my mysteries as almost social comedies. Not quite, but social comedies are usually about how relationships get screwed up. And if you think of it, murder is the sign of an ultimate failed relationship. But, I always think of character and conflict as really central to my stories. To go into the origin of the Twin Sisters mysteries a little bit, I was an academic who wrote about my native New England. And somewhere along the line, my husband has always been a big mystery reader, and I've always done some. But, over 10 years ago now, the Scandinavian noir hit it big globally, but particularly in my part of the Midwest and with people like my husband, who's 99% Norwegian The other percent is Swedish. And everybody was reading, the Stieg Larsson girl with the dragon tattoo, Henning Menkel's Wallander. And I started making fun of them. I admired them greatly. But I said, let me guess, the detective sleuth is damaged. Somebody killed his parent, lover, dog, whatever. He grew up in a bat cave. And originally, I almost started as a parody, but I did know I wanted to do a type, and that's Erik Jansson, which is sort of stoic, sort of secretly a little bit satiric, but not often does that come out. And in a way, the um, Midwestern Stoic male overlaps with a familiar type to me, the New England Stoic male, often somebody who's more at home in the outdoors and so on. So I sort of had that type in mind. And I originally started writing with just Erik. But the problem about writing about somebody who has introvert tendencies and who is a little closed-mouthed is it could be hard to draw him out. And I
Right.
was thinking, I've got to draw him out sometime. And then as Athena burst into the head of Zeus, Deb Metzger arrived. And like Erik, she's tall and athletic. Like Erik, and she's in her 30s. And like Erik, she's also attracted to women. So in the very first novel, their chief, who's nicknamed Almost All Wise, sort of says something. When she says, well, he's very hard to talk to, he says, good job for you, draw him out. Um, so it's their kind of engagement. And in the book I'm working on now, I think Erik thinks of her that the really disturbing thing about their partnership is that it works. So it's not that they hate each other. They just come from different solar systems.
Sure.
But I like and often what readers tell me is they like the interplay between the two of them because they can get on each other's nerves, but they also amuse each other.
Well, I was going to ask this a little later, but you mentioned it's all do it now because, you know, um, you mentioned humor, and I know humor does play a big role in this series. Um, Maybe not, I don't want to intimate that it's like, yuck it up kind of thing, but a wry sense of humor, which I think is very natural for, especially for partners. And my brother was a cop, so
Right.
I definitely understand that
Mhm,
almost
mhm,
gallows humor that all
mhm.
first responder type people have. But I'm curious, as a writer, does humor or satirical writing in any way or anything like that come easy or natural for you, or is that something you feel like you had to work on to develop?
When you're writing, you always have to work and develop. It rarely flows just like that. But I think I grew up with that kind of sense of humor. I grew up with a very deadpan father. Uh, and I, you know, I often tell people I'm funny on paper. Whether or not they see me as funny in person, I say, well, I'm funny on paper. So, in part, it's just how I think. And I'm actually influenced there, and I'll throw out some more literary names. Not that mystery writers don't do this too, but some Pulitzer Prize winning authors like Richard Rousseau, Louise Erdrich, James McBride. Those are writers who can take on very serious, even devastating issues like working class trauma or Native American trauma or Black trauma, but yet they can also be incredibly funny and redemptive. So I sort of looked to them as models when I started writing. And I think also as I started writing, as I got more into my topic, and maybe this is the former academic in me, I couldn't just handle it on the surface. And on one hand, the humor is important to me, uh, but like so many writers, I'm writing to figure out things. And my last published book, When the House Burns, there's a lot about homelessness in it. We had to suddenly move during the COVID shutdown. That kind of prompted that. But also, it was very hard to write a mystery set in the greater Twin Cities area after the murder of George Floyd.
Hmm.
And even though I do not and did not feel I had the right to directly refer to that in one of my books, I did make it clear that it is a changed atmosphere. and there was kind of a shadow on the detectives. At the same time, you, I write, it seems like a paradox, but to get into these issues more through my characters, but also to lighten the load. Not exactly have fun with the issues themselves, but to have some fun where you're at it, because humor is necessary to survival, as you say, particularly often with these first responders.
Oh yeah.
They gallows humor or whatever you want to call it, dead body humor, I'm calling it in my next book. They
Hmm.
have to have some dead body humor.
Yeah, I had a sister-in-law in my younger days who was a neonatal ICU nurse. And,
Mhm.
you're getting these preemies and, a lot more of them survive now than used to, but, they lost, a percentage of them. And the only way they could cope was to, I mean, some of the things that she would tell me that they would say to each other would just shock the normal person, but how else are you going to cope with losing, these poor little babies, and again, my brother was a cop. He, worked in a lot of environments where he saw lots of horrible things. I've known firefighters. I don't think you can cope if you can't
Right,
somehow find a way to lighten the mood, even with gallows humor. That said, some of the unfunniest books I've read are by alleged comedians, right? I think the harder you try to be funny on paper, the less it is. I have laughed out loud at a lot of crime fiction stuff because they'll say something and it's the situation. So it doesn't rely so much on the delivery of the line the way a comedian relies
right.
on the delivery of a line. It's more the situation, and once you get to know a character and somebody says something that's either really in line with the way you've developed that character or it's completely out of left field, as a reader, that will often make me laugh. Whereas again, I read a book by a comedian that's, oh, this is an uproariously funny book, and it doesn't even make me smile.
Right. And this is where you need outside readers. Though usually in a first draft, I just go all out. I sort of learned that trick from listening to Louise Penny in an interview.
Yeah.
But the other thing about comedy is it's about timing and pacing, but so is suspense, so are the
Yes.
thrills. So one thing I think, and this often comes through in the rewrites, both with, and you try to integrate them. Um, you know, I'm not saying people always have to be funny when they're at the edge of death. They're often not. And the detectives aren't always either. But say in one of my books, Deb Metzger is in an abandoned construction zone with a giant crane. And there's a sharpshooter out there. And she considers going up the crane, but decides she'd just be putting herself in the target like a turkey. Um, so she decides against it. But again, it doesn't always sound funny out of context.
Yeah,
And
right.
again, I fall back to, well, trust me, it's funny on paper.
Well, I noted, a lot of the reviews of your work, they really speak really consistently about the cleverness of your dialogue and because to me, dialogue is hard. I think it's one of the real touchstones of a great writer is when you write great dialogue, right? Because it is hard to do, especially if it's bigger pieces of dialogue or whatever, to catch people how they really speak, because we tend to speak in a lot of contractions and things like that are really difficult to catch on print. So I think being known as someone who writes good dialogue is a real high praise thing for a writer. Tell me a little bit about how you approach dialogue, and maybe particularly since your stories are all set in the Midwest, which every region of the country has a little bit of its own dialect and dialogue. Tell me a little bit about your approach to dialogue.
Well, first, I grew up in Maine and married a Midwesterner. So I had both, but I've been with him, for over 40 years, and I've lived in the Midwest much of my adult life. So I'm both an insider and an outsider. And I think the outsider in me picks up those differences more in some of the phrases. So I'm a little sensitive to that. I have to admit, I rewrite the dialogue a lot. I listen. And actually, there's some classic fiction writer, more from, to go back as far as the 30s, the 40s anyway, Rex Stout with the Nero Wolfe series. Um, my husband in graduate school actually was an assistant to a fellow who was writing a biography of Rex Stout and became very familiar with those novels. And your audience may not be familiar with them, with Nero Wolfe and Archie Goodwin, but there's such great dialogue in those books, and much of it is very snappy, much of it is very clever. So those are great models. Um, some TV shows like, Shakespeare. So you can look back at some of Shakespeare's comedies in particular, or even some of the Henry plays, and there's some great wordplay and dialogue in there. It's great wordplay and dialogue in rap artists. Um, the early seasons of Modern Family had great back and forth. So
Yeah.
I try to, and actually in some ways TVs and movies can be better for that because they're very abbreviated. I might mention one of my favorite classic black and white movies is My Man Godfrey, which actually has very little dialogue in it, but every word counts.
Right. Well, we're talking about the Midwest, of course, and so much of noir and crime fiction takes place in the big urban centers, LA, New York, Miami, Chicago, etc. And that's, those places become essentially a character unto themselves. Your stories, at least in this series, take place in Minnesota. And William Kent Kruger has stuff
Mhm.
that's in the upper Midwest and the Minnesota area. There's others, of course. We've all seen Fargo and all of that.
Yes.
But what makes Minnesota such a good spot for your series? I mean, I know you lived there for a long time, but you could have said it anywhere. What makes Minnesota such a good spot for you for your piece?
Well, I think, and this is particularly with the Erik Jansson character, I had some fun with that Scandinavian background that touches on Scandinavian noir. But also, Minneapolis and St. Paul, they certainly have their dark troubles, but they're manageable cities. Um, I couldn't pretend to get to know New York or something like that. And they're also cities that are very close to rural parkland farm area. Minneapolis in particular has an enormous number of parks, not to mention the lakes.
Hmm.
So that I could connect to coming from my background. And also there's a lot of Minnesotans aren't quite Canadians, but almost. There's a lot of self-deprecation and irony. One thing I went to once was a place called the Mill City Museum in Minneapolis. Now, what this is it's where like gold medal and Pillsbury flour were first milled. These go back to the 19th century and the beginnings of modern agriculture. But one of the signs when you enter says something like, you know, the Mill Museum, birthplace of carbohydrates, or something like that. So there, and if you think of um, Garrison Keillor, or, even if you've heard William Kent Kruger talk at conferences, there's a lot of humor and sort of humor being flyover country or whatever. So I think, um, and there's also still an attempt for sort of obvious goodness, even though it may not be pretentious. It had been that the Twin Cities were known for their big Fortune 500 companies for their being quite philanthropic, for their investment in the communities. Um, I can't, say right now that's still true, but still, Target has done a great deal, and some of the other industries to help out the community. So there's still, and I make a little fun of that because both my husband and I, he in the Midwest and me in Maine, came from do-gooder families. You always had to
Well,
give
you know what? I'm sorry to interrupt, but I wanted to ask you about that because, as you noted, you grew up on a farm in Maine, and
that.
we've been talking a lot about the Midwest, but how did that upbringing impact what eventually became your writing career? Uh, was there something from that has really become a big focal point in how you do what you do now?
Well, when you're in that kind of life, you have to have a lot of independence and you have to be able to amuse yourself too. But I think the independence, and again, here's where Stoic Midwesterners and Stoic New Englanders have something in common. They often keep their slightly satiric thoughts to themselves. And when they do mouth them, it's pretty sharp and on point. So I think there's some of the understatement and some of that irony that runs through both. And understanding, I know with some of your guests, you've talked about understanding setting. And even though my farm setting is quite different than the Twin Cities, and by the way, I set my mysteries there so I have an excuse to go and prowl around and check out restaurants and things. But an awareness of surroundings, even though they become quite different in urban areas. Awareness even of the weather. If you're working outside, you have to be aware of that. And both places like Maine and Minnesota, the weather is amazing. You can do almost anything with it, which you can't necessarily do so much in LA. Uh,
For real.
Even New York, somewhat, but not as much, where you could have snow in May, or you can have, especially now, a 60-degree day December 1st.
Yeah, absolutely. Switching gears here just a little bit. I mentioned that you have a story in this new anthology on fire and underwater. That, of course, it's not humorous and it's not set in Minnesota. It is set in Maine, though, if I'm not mistaken, correct?
Right, right.
Tell us a little bit about it because that really is one of my favorite anthologies of recent years. Tell us a little bit about the story, and then I have some follow-up stuff on that. But please tell us a little bit about the story.
Well, Ice Out is set in the Western Lake region of Maine. Um, my sister and her husband have a place in Rangeley, Maine, on one of these, which is one of these 6,000-acre lake. And the Appalachian Trail runs through there. So if you go north of there, and if you go east from there, northeast from there, you're pretty much in wilderness. You're in the 100-mile wilderness that is often written up as one of the hardest sections of the Appalachian Trail. So there's that in setting that in a way is incredibly inviting for its natural beauty, but also a little scary. It's also a touristy area. And when I saw, and it was Curtis Ippolito, writer you know well, who put the call out on climate change stories, I thought, well, my family in Maine works in environmental restoration now. My son, here where I am today, works in environment restoration and restitution. So I know something about this issue. And the opening image of the story is a plaque on sort of a cabin wall that gives the ice out dates for when the ice finally disappears from the lake. And that plaque is in my sister's house. So those dates are real. And yes, this is a little scary in its own right, but in that far north in Maine, you could go up almost to Memorial Day. You could go to late May, late May some years, and there'd be ice on the lake. But now it's more like early April.
Oh, wow.
It's almost like a month earlier now that the ice goes out. It was supposed to be a cold water part of the state. And that means that the fish in the lake are changing. Uh, they're, these are cold water species. The trees are more prone to diseases that are carried more easily in warm weather. Ticks. I'm getting off on my little thing there, but in the story, I'll make it short. I have a teenager, a girl, Becca, who's very annoyed by a client of her main guide family because one of these people that wants it all, and he wants to buy land around them, and they're not quite sure of the implications of that. And like so many characters in mysteries, so many of us in this era, she feels she has hardly any agency. She is so frustrated. How can she stop these immense powers? So, in fact, that's kind of the point of that whole anthology. People who are caught, um, they could originally be very good people, but they're psychologically damaged, maybe physically harmed, or corrupted by what climate change is doing to their ways of living. to where they live, where the way they work. And I need to take a drink. But the story turns around snowmobiles. Now, I haven't been on a snowmobile in decades, but actually, for the novel that'll be coming out next year, I did have to research them some more. So I pulled that into the story. Excuse me. Snowmobiles can be quite modern machines. They can look like something very space age now, and they can be very light. Though there are snowmobiles that are older or because they're for utility, for hauling supplies. And snowmobiles often have a very practical function in the north. Um, those could be much heavier. And yes, they do really break through the ice. Um, the lake my sister lives on saw such a catastrophe several years ago when three men fell through in a January and weren't recovered until ice out in May.
Oh,
So
wow.
there's that very frightening thing. And that kind of incident is becoming more common. Excuse me.
No problem.
As you know, it's raining heavily here, and
Yes.
I get very congested.
No problem. No problem.
But I will say one thing since you were asking about dialogue. Thing when I got the edits back, in general, edits are always the right thing. But in a few lines, the editors wanted to tweak because they thought they weren't idiomatic. And I said, well, they're idiomatic to Maine, not to Minnesota, not to New York, not to Ohio, but they're idiomatic to Maine. So it was very important to me to keep in some of the phrases that were in that book. In fact, to the point where the
Yeah.
father doesn't even really talk, or hardly at all.
Yeah. Yeah. Definitely had that stoic demeanor. You know, um, I'm going to skip ahead again here a little bit because, you know, we are in very troubling times on many fronts in this country and the world. Climate change is obviously a huge one globally. We have other issues here in the United States that we're all very concerned about. So I want to ask you about the role that art and creativity plays in all of this for how we are coping with these things that are happening in our world. You mentioned earlier, some of the things that maybe threw you off a little bit and slow down your normal writing process. When COVID started, I had a whole series of in this for this series just on how people were trying to maintain their creativity during COVID. Um, because you just knew that this is going to be a problem, right, for people. Because I know me, I struggle with it when it's in situations like this. But throughout history, artists and musicians, writers, every form of creative has played a role in helping society deal with whatever the struggles of the day have been. What is your perspective now on the role of the arts and creativity in this very Trumpian world we're living in, which often seems, I know a lot of people that I'm around, they struggle with hopelessness, almost like a sense of grief over some of the most insane things that we are seeing that I think a lot of us of a certain age in particular never thought we would see in our lifetimes, and yet here we are. And just maybe what role do you see the arts and creativity playing in our society right now as it is and facing these struggles?
Well, this in a way is a paraphrase of what I said earlier, but I think art and writing can both help you confront the problem, but can also help lighten it. Um, I know with COVID, there was, we had to move because of it, essentially, and I use this in one of my novels. The basement of the house we were living in during the shutdown became toxic because pipes had failed. So I kind of use that in a humorous way in the book where suddenly the whole detective agency has to move because the plumbing has failed. But it was highly stressful and I wasn't doing much writing. And like so many writers, I was having a book coming out and I was clueless at that time as to how to promote it. The book was even delayed because paper was going into uh, all of the sanitary materials that was being made. Um, and sometimes you have to give yourself a break. And I think I wrote a short story that is yet to be published that was more COVID based. As I said, also what happened, and at this time I was still living in Minnesota, George Floyd was killed. And at some point, I just had to say, I have to write about this more as a journal. I don't know if it'll go into a book or not, but I can't just write my mysteries set in the Twin Cities as if nothing like this happened. I just couldn't. It would seem too false. Um, so I did kind of almost like journaling. And some of that ended up in the character Deb Metzger's thoughts. And some of it, in the book When the House Burns, there's a display case in this investigative agency. And it's generally little jokey things, but then suddenly a weeping angel appears, a black fist appears, things that are edgier or more sorrowful, a list of the officers who've been killed in duty, things like this, names of people who've been killed who had done no wrong, it seems. So I had to work it in there in some way. But then there's much humor in the book too to sort of lighten it. And right now, as I said, I have a book out waiting to come back for the edits. Partly I have to edit that just because so many things have changed. I have an art student in this forthcoming book who has to use AI, but also figure out how to use it responsibly. That's become much more intense,
Right.
especially with Anthropic here in San Francisco, using so many, millions of pirated books, including mine, and probably many mystery writers, to train Claude, an editing assistant. Um, and also, I have a character, minority character in that new book who wants to start some DEI initiatives in the milk producing industry she works in. But that's tense in the book already, but I think I have to now make it even tenser. So it is a challenge. And I think it hurts the imagination. It does, these shocks um, to your values, especially if you know people who are being injured in some way.
Hmm.
So if you're writing to make a living, you have to think of ways around it. And I think for me, some of it is journaling, where you can, and then later you can separate out what is just private to me and what might work in a plot that has a definite place to go. Um,
Yeah.
Also, I feel without agency unless I'm writing. I think so many of us, even like I now belong to League of Women Voters, so you think that would give me and the other members some agency. But I think so many of us, and I'm sure you can speak to this, feel as if we have no power in this current situation.
Yeah.
Uh, and writing at least creates you can at least give your character some agency or figure or have them test how much agency they have. That's also true in the Ice Out story. How much agency can a 16-year-old girl have? And what can she do? And
Well, I find those things inspiring as a reader because, but by whatever form, or as viewing art or listening to music, or because I feel like those are the things that remind us that there is something beyond all this misery, right? And look, if you're a Trump fan, you can just turn me off right now. But I'll just tell you that
right.
is one of the things I see from this particular administration is they have no appreciation of any kind of beauty. They have no appreciation for any kind of creativity or any kind of anything happy. Everything with them is misery. How can we inflict the most misery? How can we build the most self-aggrandizing monuments to
Right.
ourselves? How can we change lies to truth? All of these things that I think, you know, it's intended, I think, to demoralize people.
Yes,
I think
I
one of the reasons that authoritarian governments, since we've crawled out of the primordial ooze a billion years ago, have always gone after creatives first is because they are trying to break the human spirit and turn us into these little drones that just go to work and do what we're told. And that's why I think it is so important for creative people, whatever form that may be, to keep doing the thing they're doing because it gives the rest of us something to turn to that isn't the news and all of the other stuff that is
right.
coming in this world. And so I admire folks like yourself. And I was going to say earlier, we met because I moderated a panel. I think it was at Left Coast Crime with yourself and several other authors that who have a lot of social justice themes in your work. And I just think that is so important because it does give people an outlet in some
Mhm.
way. When you can't maybe say the thing you want to say in our world, you can escape into story or art or music where someone is able to say it for whatever reason. So, um, I find it really interesting too, that even for yourself, you say some of it you have to separate. You can't even put that into your work. And for I'm sure the reasons are varied why that is the case. Um, I don't know if I have a question in there. I'm just blabbling,
Well,
man,
I think it's like what is I don't write books that are self-confession. Every author puts something of himself or herself into a book, but you know, I write in some ways, writing is a very self-absorbed thing to do that can help you get out of self-absorption. Sort of an irony there too. But often in my writing, I can look for things that maybe offer a momentary reprieve or the beginnings of a way out. In the Ice Out story, um, there's actually a functional family.
hmm
Uh, that care for each other, even though not much is said between them. And it ends in a kitchen with warm tea as, all right, maybe there's a body in the lake, but we'll just ignore they're warm anyway while the body's out there in the lake. But I think being reminded of those relationships is important. As I said, relationships are very important to me in my writing, partly because you can have, these very nasty conflicts between people. And you can have people who don't necessarily jibe, like the two detectives, but they work out a way that they can solve things together. And again, in sort of that stoic way, they can boost each other up when one of them's down.
hmm
It may be through teasing or mockery, but they won't let each other sink.
Right.
And I think that's very important. I think that's kind of what you're getting back to. And, have, I don't write books that are explicitly political and mention candidates or anything like that, or
Right.
even really parties that much. But crime affects the people with the least resources often, those on the margin. In the case of the short story, it's a family in Maine that doesn't have national or world influence. They don't run a huge corporation. And in the novel, sometimes it's like in one novel, it's a young biracial musician who struggles with addiction. Um,
Yeah.
in another, it's a real estate agent. And one real estate's been murdered, and another one feels very vulnerable.
Well, to
Excuse
me,
me.
those are the best ways to get a point across anyway. I had Richie Narvaez on the show a few weeks ago, and he's also got a story in the anthology. And as I was saying to him, one of the reasons I've really appreciated this particular piece of work so much is because it doesn't beat you over the head. It doesn't read like
Right.
an after school special in print. It's these very real situations. And it's one of the things I really liked about Ice Out is that, yes, you are showing very clearly that this situation that this family is in has been brought about by the change in the climate. So it's absolutely on theme, but and I wouldn't necessarily say it's overly subtle, but it's also not something where, it's a five-alarm fire in front of your face. And it is the situation that they find themselves in, and it is brought about by the change in the environment. And so you create characters that exist in that environment as it is. And so what happens directly because of it, but you're not out there, waving a big flag that says, see, this is because of climate change. It really, and I thought every story in this anthology was very good at that. It
Mm.
was, a very good, solid through line, but not one, I don't want to call out anything. I saw a movie quite a few years ago now, that was very much themed on, the civil rights struggle, but it just, again, it felt like an after school special. It was just, and I feel like a lot of those pieces of art have fallen into that. Let me just beat you over the head with it. And I just don't think that's effective, right? I mean, if you're trying to convey to people a sense of something is wrong and something needs to be done about it. I think the way you have done it in your books and the way it is done in this anthology is for me, not for everybody, but for me, it's a
Mm.
much more effective way of getting your point across. And so I do hope people pick up a copy of it, because I think it's a really worthwhile read.
I think
Um, I only have um, one more serious question, and then we'll close this out. But just a really quick one. I know you previously written a children's book and then a nonfiction book on Robert Frost and Andrew Wyeth. Do you have any plans to do any more of either one of those, either more children's books or any more nonfiction books?
perhaps children's books. I did have to write some academic nonfiction. That was another thing that slowed me down. I had a couple of obligations to complete. They weren't whole books, but I think I'm retired from academics now. So I think mischief is what I want, just to get into mischief with these books. Children's books, maybe because the next another generation is coming along, and I sort of write for the children in my family. So I'll just have to see. But I sort of like the detective, if you had told me when I was in the middle of my academic career that I would write a mystery, I would have said, you got to be kidding. I can't plot. But I do need a problem to solve, which, like the detectives, I do need to work some things through. And I do quite a bit of research for most of my novels. And I do get fascinated with certain areas to the point of going down rabbit holes. But um, also, I would just add one other thing. I was in a lot of do-gooder fundraising situations, and I had to smile a lot. And it was just time for people to die.
I love that. Well, as anyone who has seen my show before, listened to my show, I always close on this hypothetical question, where I become this omnipotent being who can put you together with any one of the following three people for whatever you want, a conversation, cross country skiing, whatever it is makes you happy. Who would you choose and why? And the three folks I'm going to give you, your three options are uh, Colonel Joshua Chamberlain. And there's a through line for the options I give people. You'll probably figure it out pretty quickly.
Yes.
But Colonel Joshua Chamberlain, Joan Benoit Samuelson, the great marathoner,
Mhm.
or the great game creator, Milton Bradley. One of those three people I can put you with for whatever you want. Who would you choose and why?
You could almost add the newly elected mayor of New York, Mamdani, because he went to the same college as Chamberlain and Joan Benoit Samuelson and myself. And let's
Which is
see,
Bowdoin.
Gordon in
Yeah.
Maine. Um, I think Chamberlain would have stories to tell. And he's been, if anyone in your audience doesn't know, he led the main troops in the Civil War and the Battle of Gettysburg. And according to some nonfiction and somewhat fictionalized books, they held, was it,
Little Round Top.
they held Little Round Top with bayonets They helped turn the tide of that battle and therefore the tide of the Civil War. And by the way, that movie was good in the Gettysburg movie, which is based on a book.
Mhm.
It was very good actually in the way the men from Maine talked to each other.
There you go. Well, as you probably figured out, all three of those people are native Mainers.
Right,
Yes, and of course the movie Gettysburg is based on the book The Killer Angels.
right.
Great book. A pretty good movie. Jeff Daniels' portrayal of Joshua Chamberlain is just spectacular.
It is.
That whole thing. And I've been to Gettysburg. I've been to Little Round Top. I'm not a Civil War buff per se, but I'm a history person. I love history. So, great choice. I think Colonel John. Do you
I,
know too a
I
little?
might add one other thing since you're on the Civil War. Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe was written in that same town because her husband at the time was teaching at Bowdoin.
I did
Now,
not
she
know
was
that.
more associated with Ohio and Massachusetts,
Sure,
but the actual writing happened in that town. And Joshua Chamberlain would have been exposed to quite a number of abolitionists. And I've gotten way off topic, but maybe, like you were saying, it's good to look for heroes, even unlikely ones in this moment, even if it's a 16-year-old girl or her taciturn father, or
absolutely.
it's a musician doesn't know what she's gotten herself into.
Well, one last little bit of Joshua Chamberlain trivia. When he passed, he essentially died because of a bullet wound in his hip that he suffered at Gettysburg. I think it was at Gettysburg. Can't remember which one, but this bullet wound. They were never able to get the musket ball out of his body. So eventually, when he died, it was because of that bullet wound. So he is technically the last person to die from the Civil War. And it was about 40 years after the war that he died, but it was directly connected to his wound that he suffered there. So he is generally considered to be the last casualty of the American Civil War. I did not know that until recently, but I find that also fascinating. I find this conversation fascinating. I hope you out there, if you're listening to this or watching, I hope you do too. Priscilla, thank you so much for coming on the
Well,
show.
thank
I,
you,
I
Rich.
really appreciate it. I'm going to remind everybody too, if you haven't become acquainted with the Twin City Mystery Series, highly recommend it. On Fire and Underwater anthology, short story crime fiction anthology, which explores the connection between climate change and crime. Highly recommend that. A lot of great stuff in there, a lot of great authors. And all I can say is if I hope that everything we've talked about today has inspired you or somebody you know to keep writing or to start writing, whatever it is. It's a tough game, but it's a good game, and there's a lot of great people in it. And I really hope this has been helpful to you. So, Priscilla, thank you so much for coming on the open mic Writers in Their Own Words.
Thank you.
And I will remind all of you, please hit subscribe if you haven't done so. Tell a friend if you like the show. As I always say, if you didn't like the show, just keep it to yourself. You don't need to tell anybody. Otherwise, just remember, look, tomorrow is not promised to any of us. So whatever you do, make today count. So for my guest, Priscilla Paton, and myself, Rich Eisen, this has been the open mic. We'll see you next time.